I am back with the lighting that I prefer. This recent lighting I've been using. The Mac video was a little washed out. It was earlier in the day, and now I get the extreme contrast, which I really like. There's it's like dark, almost black back here, and then I'm right here, and I'm like golden and glowing. I'm like a rainbow in the dark, and I dig it. You guys let me know what you think if you want to. Back there is my I'm pointing to the screen, but you can't see that. My there we go. My video library, my Blu-ray library. In January, I'm going to give you all a tour of the video. I'm going to give you a tour of the Blu-ray library. Shoot it on my newer phone. I was forced to buy a new phone a couple of months ago. I probably mentioned this. Mine died. I knew it was coming, and it came. But so now I'm paying on this super duper deluxe Samsung Galaxy S2, S22. I worked with phones for a living for 3 years, so I'm trying to apply what I learned to this, because there's a lot more high tech than the last one. I had the S7, but that S7, man, it lasted 4.5 years. It went through a lot. Anyway, I wanted to talk about a kind of a theme or a tendency within, what would you call it, heroic fiction, or modern heroic fiction, modern mythology. Action stories, superhero stories, science fiction stories, genre stories. I think things are changing, and they're upending. And I wanted to talk about that, and I want to talk about how it applies to my work on Flickr Street, which may or may not interest anyone, but I'm going to talk about it in a broader sense as well. Okay, so when we're growing up, and we see good guys versus bad guys, just to be simple about it. The bad guy, what are the bad guy's goals? Unless the bad guy's goals are directly to harm the good guy or harm the good guy's loved ones, like a vendetta, or they have a one-on-one rivalry, and that informs a lot of heroic fiction. But in a more general sense, if there's not a personal stake that the hero has in what the villain is doing, the hero is opposing the villain out of pure altruism. So, in other words, you can blend the two, and I think that's cool. In other words, the hero can have an animus against the villain and vice versa, and also try to stop the villain from upending the established order. And that's what I think has been the dominant archetype for a while, certainly in the 20th century, certainly in American fiction or Western fiction. Is the hero's goal is to oppose the villain, stop the villain from challenging, destroying, upending, reversing the current order of things, the government, society, the way things are, the way things are done, the way things have always been, and according to the, what the story is trying to tell you, the way it has to be. So isn't that a limiting paradigm? I think it is. Because we have seen in real life, in our own Western culture, and especially in the United States of America, we have seen over my lifetime and earlier. But I was born several years after JFK was assassinated. My mom told me a lot about how she felt that day. My dad chimed in once in a while on it. The consensus was everything changed then. Of course, you can go to earlier points where everything changed. Things became gray, and They weren't so black and white and that kind of thing. Um, that's part of what I'm trying to say, but I'm really trying to say the idea that the established order uh, does not have your best interests in mind, and that if a hero is trying to stop someone from upending that order that is unfair to those who live beneath its structure, uh, then the hero is actually causing harm to regular people, citizens, humans, fellow humans, and other creatures. And I do include animals. Because, you know, think about the goals of some of these characters. Okay, so what is Superman always trying to do? He's trying to do, this is his old motto for a while. Anyway, I know it wasn't his original one. Superman began as a working class character. The kids were basically poor farmers, and they took all the money they had to send this kid to school in Smallville, which wasn't exactly I was going to accidentally say this. Wasn't exactly a metropolis, little m or big M. Um, and once he was in Metropolis, after he'd graduated from Smallville, uh, he started helping the working man, and he used his powers pretty recklessly. I mean, they were. He was a very Hugo Danner like character, as in the lead character in Philip Wiley's classic novel Gladiator. Gladiator is a really dark and to me, it's very dark and dystopian view of someone who's born, invincible, can't be harmed, invulnerable, super strong, super everything. And to me, Gladiator, I hate that I don't currently own a copy. I don't know that I've ever owned a copy. I do have a copy of Man God, which was the Marvel preview adaptation of Gladiator, but it only adapted the first half of the book. It was adapted by Roy Thomas, who wrote it, and Tony DeZuniga did the art. I want to say maybe though he only inked it, but maybe he did all of it. Very much his vibe anyway. And it's a really tragic tale. Later, Roy Thomas reiterated this character in his series, The Young All Stars, published by DC in the late 80s, and went back over his origin, and this time did all of it. And of course, had one of his major characters, Arn Monroe, be the son of Hugo Danner. Young All Stars, by the way, is a comic book that I strongly recommend to superhero fans and also to pulp and weird fiction fans because it's kind of a crossover. It's not like all superheroes like the All Star Squadron or Justice Society, which Roy was working on prior to that. Young All Stars is kind of a wartime, World War II, his favorite setting. Kind of melange of things, and part of it's Roy and his lifelong interest. Part of it is his wife Dan helping him with characterization and making his characterization more naturalistic and more realistic as far as female dialogue and point of view. And then Jean-Marc Lefistier, who provides a ton of literary brilliance and knowledge about these kind of characters, heroic characters and pulp characters and literary characters. But anyway, so let me go backwards. So that was Arn Monroe. We'll go back to Hugo Danner. Hugo Danner was a huge influence on Superman. So consequently, Superman, began in a very simple costume, kind of like I believe it was kind of pattern, maybe like what circus performers wore at the time. Feel free to correct me on any of this, but as far as my facts, but don't correct my opinions. They're right. I'm just kidding. But basically, he was fighting like what evil slumlords and racketeers and protection rackets. He was a hero of the people, even though this wasn't his race. He was taught these values by the Kents. Now, these were not initially I mean, yeah, they might read in a corny way because the dialogue wasn't as sophisticated as later was, standard in comic books, even superhero comic books. But conceptually, it was more pure. It was Siegel and Schuster, and yes, they got ideas from Gladiator and several other, you know, they grew up in the golden age of science fiction, but they were writing alongside it. I mean, they created Superman well before they sold it to DC. Jerry Siegel was influenced by, but also a contemporary of writers like Philip Wiley and Olaf Stapleton, A. Van Vogt, who I consider, all three of those, and I'm sure I'm forgetting someone else's favorite just on the top of my head. My friend Tim McLean can help me with this. But basically, those are three examples I can just throw out of writers who were instrumental in the golden age of science fiction, and science fiction becoming much more cerebral, technology becoming much more up to date with technological advances in the 20th century, and then speculating beyond that. And quite a huge amount of the things speculated upon in the 1930s have, by the 2020s, they're here. We're living them, for better or worse. So, anyway, my thing is, so what motivates these heroes in heroic fiction? So, Superman is fighting an established order. Now, admittedly, it's like a criminal, corrupt order, but like I said, a slumlord. Okay, so that's a guy who's accepted by society. He's a landlord, but no one reins him in. No one regulates him. He can exploit other people, just like corporations that can exploit their workers, and hence the need for unions. So I would say, the original Superman would be more like a guy who would be friendly to unions, and even though those were established, uh, the establishment, those are things were part of the establishment, that he would challenge them, and thereby lie, and within that lies the true heroism. Now, Superman quickly went, uh, you know, that naturalism and humble storytelling. It didn't last long because Superman exploded, and they revised his costume and expanded his supporting cast and had him fight more powerful villains. Villains that might stand half a chance of hurting him. None of these humans that he was tossing around could. I'm sure they were all, dead. Um, so those villains were basically trying to, you know, take over the world, take over society, subjugate society. So, and then, go into World War II, and, the Nazis, the Axis powers, the bad guys, they're trying to take over, subjugate society too. They exploited and murdered and genocided people. So the lines seemed very clear back then and very clear cut, as far as things go. Like Nazis are bad. Um, but, the thing is, as time went on, like into the 50s, Captain America was going after communists. Communists aren't inherently bad. And, then it became jingoistic. They're going after Chinese communists once that revolution hit. A lot of Stan Lee's scripts, which he may or may not have wholly written himself, were pretty racist, really, against Chinese communists. They were anti-communist anyway. They're all like, commie this and commie that. Especially in comics like, well, like in Ant-Man, where you have a lot of science fiction elements. Hank Pym is always like trying to fight the commies, and his first wife was Russian, and she got killed by the commies. Iron Man, of course, is a munitions manufacturer, so he's right in the middle of the military-industrial complex, fighting the commies. And those two particular um, talked a lot about the commies. The Fantastic Four originally wanted to beat the commies to the moon. You say this word commie over and over, it gets annoying. But basically, communism was evil according to Stanley, and I guess Jack Kirby too, since Jack Kirby actually plotted the stories out visually and more or less pretty much wrote everything that his name was on. In the sense of work, please see my video. What does a comic book collector actually do? I mean, I'm sorry. What does a comic book creator actually do? And that's my view on things, on that controversy. But, several years later, Stan Lee, through his soapbox and his public persona was like super liberal and anti-racist. And, he wasn't the kind of guy who would name names if he'd been around. If that Stan Lee had been around in the early 50s, he wouldn't have been naming names. He wouldn't have been one of the Hollywood, or he would have been one of the Hollywood 10. He would not have sold out. He would have denied he was a communist. He'd be up there with William Gaines. That's Stan Lee. I believe Stan Lee was trying to emulate William Gaines in many ways, but that's a topic for another video, I guess. Whereas the Stan Lee of the early 60s would have been like, ferret out the commies. Let's rid Hollywood of all these commies. Fuck Dalton Trumbo. And it's weird. I haven't really read much to explain how his socio-political views that came out during his comic books that were very, very hardcore, the comic books he edited and published, if not wholly wrote, stack up against the liberal persona, the classic liberal persona he projected the very end of the 1960s and definitely all through the 1970s. Jack Kirby didn't project that persona per se, but his stuff became more about the whole mythic battle of good and evil. And really, in his stuff, it was kind of unimpeachable. In other words, it was clear cut. It was like the deviants want to subjugate humanity and hurt people and exploit people. Eternals have to fight them. There you go. But Eternals are beautiful, right? Deviants are ugly. So why do you have Thena and Crow? What's the attraction? Why does Thena go to the meetings of Brother Toad, the ruler of the deviants, and Crow and all the other deviants? Why does she go there and hang out with them and dally around with Crow? Why is there a character called the Reject who's the deviant, but he looks like a beautiful long-haired human man? And then there's Carcass, who's a mutate, which is basically like a creature created by the deviants to be evil, but he's a philosophical poet and he's kind. So there were balances. It wasn't cut and dried. All the deviants aren't bad. Maybe they're just bad because they're ugly and they've been alienated. There's that, the movie Captain Marvel. One thing to me, the best thing about that movie was the way they redefined the Skrulls. And I know they're going to undo some of that or fuck around some of it during Secret Invasion series coming up. But the Skrulls were refugees. And they were. The Kree were the warlike. The Kree were basically like the Western imperialists. Mostly white. Some of them were blue. That would be like the token black people of color. And characters like Minerva and the one Demon Honsu played. I'm not saying his name right. But the big glorious ones, obviously Burrs or Captain Marvel or Carol Danvers, and of course Jan Rog. They're like the Star Force they have is basically like, we're gonna kill the Skrulls. Skrulls are like the black and brown people of the world that the U.S. is constantly intervening in with regime change, warfare, and they become refugees. And the only way they can survive, really, in this case, is their shape-shifting ability. Now, of course, that means some of them are going to use that to spy and get up to perfidious activities. And I'm sure that's where Secret Invasion's headed. But it's not as cut and dried as in the comic book. I mean, there have been hints of sympathetic Skrulls over the years here and there, but generally not. And again, you got to remember Kirby created the Skrulls too, and the Kree. So, there's thematic, waves and arcs here. He had his own cosmology, regardless of who published who published it, or what other people's characters it tied into or crossed over with. He had his own vision, his own cosmology that pretty consistently flows over the decades. Um, but yeah, anyway, what I was saying is in the Captain Marvel film, the Skrulls are not bad guys. They are shunned and they are victimized. So I thought it was a brilliant. I'm not saying the movie was as a whole brilliant. I don't believe it was. I think it's much better than a lot of people give it credit for. But I do believe the analogy, the way they handle the Korean War, are brilliant. And the key to the heroism of a character like Marvel, the original Captain Marvel in Marvel Comics, who's kind of fairly reimagined for the Captain Marvel movie. He was sent as a spy on Earth and to invade, and eventually he realized, his race is evil. They are, I mean, generally, their governments are evil. The established order is, uh, you know, detrimental to other living beings. They want to take over and subjugate, and yet they're the established order. That they're his race. They're where he came from. They're all the militarism has run amok, and that's why he's Captain Marvel, and he's one of them. But he turns on them. He turns on his own people, and he sees how wrong their ideology is, and how it's about destruction, enslavement, subjugation, murder, warfare, uh, just like the imperialism we have in the world today, carried out by the West. And um, that's what I think that's what makes Marvel a noble hero and a more. Carol Danvers is a fine character, but Marvel is a more compelling character because he saw the evil of the Kree, and sometimes he saw good in Skrulls. I mean, things were not gray in black and white; they were gray. And to me, he was a very altruistic character, a very pure character, morally pure character. Uh, but he didn't begin as one. He had to go through a lot of evolution. In some ways, genuine evolution, because we're talking about a guy who was gifted with cosmic awareness. And so, anyway, that's a hero who fought against the established order, not the villains, the hero. To me, that is where the archetype is going, if it's going to survive and be viable and resonate with people in the West and people you know in America certainly who consume this kind of material, is that we need to see those who go against the grain uh, as the heroes. We no longer need to see the government as something that needs to be saved, safeguarded, protected, obeyed. No, because it's been proven to us in real life that that's all fiction. It's all fiction. So in fiction, we're going to have real life. I mean, Uh, so let me break it down how my story evolved with that ideological shift. As I went through an ideological internal shift, is originally my characters were heroes. We're talking way back in high school and the early days when it was when what I was doing was called Dynamite Comics, and I was collaborating with Thomas Davis, Christopher Pack, both of who are no longer with us, RIP, and the guys I refer to as JJ and HB, for good reasons. That's all I refer to them as. And we were on the whole thing. They're heroes, right? And so then we had characters like Skull Corporation and Kong, and Kong ran the Skull Corporation. The Skull Corporation had their hands in everything. They were going to take over the world, and infiltrate the government and, blah, blah, blah. And it was all going to be under their reign. And, many people that worked with the Skull Corporation were going to, you know, perpetrate all these evil deeds. So once this thing became focused into something where it was just me writing these stories, which that occurred around 1989, I I started seeing things differently. I started seeing things differently in 88 and 89. And it's interesting because the rift between me and this cat JJ is, he was kind of from a higher class than me, not by much, but that's the way they acted in my school and in our neighborhood and in our city. And then he went to the army and was kind of further brainwashed. And he became a different person because he was starting to want to write stories denouncing conservatives because, Reagan, we all hated Reagan and Bush and all those shady fuckers, Oliver North. And I was definitely going in that direction. I was in that direction. And JJ was, uh, he was starting to kind of slide into line. I wasn't really converting him, but he was seeing both sides of it, and he was just realizing that you could make these conservative characters sympathetic through good writing and multidimensional writing, but that ultimately they were in the wrong, because the things they did to other humans and to society were detrimental. It was based around exploitation and harm of others for their own empowerment, their own self-aggrandizement, their own enrichment, inner and outer, as in wealth and treasure. But when once he went away and we talked a little, very little, his choice in 1988 9. It's obvious that he believed in that establishment. Now he was part of it. He was no longer He was no longer going to write stories about people who went against the grain, who rebelled against the grain, who were outside of society. I mean, one huge influence on both of us, in high school, I guess it's an obvious one from the times that we were growing up, was Watchmen. And I guess Watchmen influenced everyone at that time who was reading and writing and interested in comics. And Rorschach was a big influence on us both as far as vigilante heroes. And, I already had this vigilante hero of Alec Duarte, and uh, who he later used the pseudonym Cowan. Uh, he had another name originally, but I'm not going to say it. But it was one of those. It's used by a world famous character, and so obviously I wasn't going to use it once I moved into this thing as a serious solo um, saga. I changed his name to Cowan, which is like a Masonic word for an outsider. Um, no relation to the great artist Dennis Cowan, who I met, who's really cool. Um, but anyway, so I was left with this dichotomy. Who is the good guy? Is it the all American character, Thomas Ledge? He's a major character in Flicker Street, almost kind of a throwback character, like a machismo kind of character, kind of my dad's generation, or whatever that generation was called, the generation before the silent generation, or a guy of that generation. You know, um, kind of like a Humphrey Bogart meets Clint Eastwood meets Charles Bronson, but not as cool because probably a lot of John Wayne in the DNA too. Um, and in time, I realized that Thomas Ledge was not the hero, wasn't not even a hero, but he was still a major character. He still regarded himself as a hero. And I have several characters like that, and they generally work for the government. And since this is also around the time that Dark Knight came out, and in that one, Reagan, or Reagan like being is president in the future, and Superman is not aged, and he's a puppet of this system, and Batman has lost respect for him and finally beats him. And I was so happy when it happened because I hated the character of Superman anyway. And I've kind of come full circle because I later started liking the character Superman and the mythology of it. My gateway drugs were, the Christopher Reeve movies and the early seasons of Smallville. And I started liking Superman after John Byrne has stopped writing Superman. And of course, his worldview is very Nickian and very right wing. So I had no interest in that. And the Superman before the Crisis on Infinite Earths was all powerful. It was there was nothing to the character, nothing interesting. So later you had some writers who did some interesting work, and eventually you had wonderful gifts to us, the readers, like Grant Morrison and Frank Whiteley's All-Star Superman, which to me was like the final word of Superman. And of course, Alan Moore and Kurt Swan, George Perez's story. I think it's Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, which I've only read once. I've never owned. Those are key stories because they explain, that nostalgia and that affection and that purity or desire for purity that made Superman an iconic character in the 1950s and 1960s, and I guess 1940s too, but especially the 50s, kind of the square jawed, all powerful guy, all the way down to the 70s, like invincible guy. But he had his own mythology, Krypton and Kandor and Supergirl and the Legion of Superheroes and the Daily Planet and Brainiac and Lex Luthor. He had Crypto. He had this whole mythology around him, and so that's when I started liking Superman. In the 90s and 2000s. But I've kind of come full circle with Superman as a character because I've been encountering stories about Superman from different periods. And I really think a lot of it comes down to me ideologically. And a lot of this, I think, was spurred by watching the Zack Snyder Superman iteration. Because I really believe that Superman's, okay, I'm going to paraphrase Daredevil and the Punisher, you're one bad day away from being me, Daredevil. The Punisher says, I feel like Superman is one bad day away from being Homelander from The Boys. And I actually think Homelander is a much more interesting character than Superman. So I'm kind of not a fan of the character Superman. I mean, I'm kind of a detractor of the character Superman. I mean, until someone comes along and shows me something different, something fresh. But I mean, I'm even kind of worn out on Batman, but that's a whole other ball of wax. Uh, but Superman, I think my infatuation with him that lasted for about on and off for about 20 years. I wasn't really a fan, but I liked the character, the mythology. Liked him. Liked him. The mythology I liked. I got distracted. I got a notification from a friend. Um, but no more because I feel like what he represents is what Frank Miller was showing, that he was a pawn of truth, justice, and the American way. So it's implying that the American way is like the whole way of life. The lifestyle of America, which is really America in the 1950s. Prosperous America, rich America, middle class and upper middle class America. But white people, see, you can't forget the minorities that didn't live that. And some suffering poor whites. But my dad didn't grow up rich. He was able to go to college. He was able to do the GI Bill and other things. He was able to go to college. He was able to get a couple of degrees. I think he had 3 degrees. And he was able to buy a house in the 60s and have a kid, me. But it was hard. we because my mom didn't work, and a lot of women didn't work back then. They were wives and housewives and mothers. Uh, so my dad, uh, he struggled. When he passed, he actually did have a good bit of money saved up, and he left it to me, um, which changed my life a lot. He left me the house, and the house was worth quite a bit. The property, not so much. The house itself was kind of kind of trashed, but the property value where we were was like an in neighborhood place to be. I mean, we were always the poorest people in the neighborhood. We were like the po white trash of these other people who were kind of like these. The kids were all like these preppy. You know what I mean? They didn't hang out with black people like I did. My friend Nathan, my friend Vincent, etc. Or you know, and I lusted after black girls in high school. They didn't do that. They were like JJ, and a particular friend of JJ's who I won't name, who I find to be an unctuous individual. And those kind of people were snobs. Their parents were snobs. That's what we call them back then. My mom called them snooty, and my mom had all kinds of derisive names for them. Um, fuck those people. That's how I see things now. Maybe that sounds too crude and reductive, but the fact is, they're part of the problem. They're not part of the solution. They're benefiting from the system screwing everyone else over. And that gets back to what I'm saying. So in Flicker Street, I started looking at characters like Thomas Ledge as maybe not the villain, but definitely a symptom of the system that caused harm, a puppet of the system, just like Superman was in Dark Knight Returns. I began to see Kong differently. I began to see Kong as a revolutionary. This was a long time. His arc. For some reason, I started writing him more and more sympathetically. And recently, I've rewritten his origin a bit. His origin can be found in the document that's on my website, Flicker Street, The Birth. But I've been taking that and I've been reworking it and really getting deep into the ideology of the character and how he evolved. And some of the characters that worked with him, uh, they really did have malicious intent towards certain people and certain parts of society. And that's it's interesting, and his right hand man, Phileas Caleb, was always with him. And Phileas Caleb, he wanted to throw over the established order. Phileas Caleb was a prodigy. He was a red haired, part Irish, uh, gay Jewish scientist, and he's like the most brilliant scientist of Earth. And he's pretty, he's pretty evil. I mean, not because he's gay or Jewish. I'm not demonizing him. I was trying to add dimensions to him, and Caleb, well, I just came up with that name. So I thought, well, he's probably Jewish. Um, my point with that character, who's still one of my major characters, who I love writing, and I'm just itching to draw. I drew him once many years ago, and I kind of still have that. I lost that drawing, but I still have it kind of in my head. But I want to refine it and make it more realistic. Phileas Caleb, he's ambiguous. He's a morally ambiguous character. He loves his daughter. That's one big thing. He did briefly, have a beard, a covered woman, fellow scientist. They had an affair, and she had a child. They were married. I think married very briefly. Um, but he has a daughter named Sage Caleb, and she's one of my major characters too. She's been through a lot. But Phileas Caleb is kind of the character that he's willing to do really evil stuff to get what he wants, and he doesn't. He of course he hates the establishment, but he kind of also wants to exploit people too. Um, so what I've ended up with this storyline, instead of Kong being shadowy guy and everything, he wants to take over the world, whatever. The Kong is really a revolutionary, and but he does have the Malcolm X like credo of by any means necessary. Of course, Malcolm X never murdered anyone, but characters inspired by Malcolm X, like Magneto, did murder people because they were willing to do what they needed to do to achieve their objectives by any means necessary. So Kong was that kind of guy. Uh, so yeah, complicated. But I finally killed him off. My current pivotal character, Ellinger, uh, is inheriting this. He's literally inheriting a lot of things from Kong and his organizations or orgs. And he's black and he's like a black power kind of character. He's a super leftist radical socialist and Marxist, and he does want to take over the world, but not to exploit others and not for self enrichment. He wants to upend the world. He wants to upend the power structure so that the oppressed rise to the top and the oppressors, well, whatever, eat the rich, eat the guillotine, whatever, whatever fate they deserve, karmic fate, they bring on themselves. I'm not saying he's going to round them up and kill them all, but they're not going to be in charge. This is in his mind. There's no way in hell they're ever going to get this back. And for a lot of disenfranchised people and people of color and alienated people throughout the planet right now, especially not in the West, that's a fantasy. That's like I was talking about on my Wakanda Forever video. Ellinger is kind of like if T'Challa decided if you combine T'Challa and Eric Killmonger and decided, okay, enough is enough. We're going to do what Killmonger said he wanted to do. But we're going to have some limit, some nobility like T'Challa. And some of the decisions will be hard and will be cut and dried. And that's what gives Ellinger an inner conflict. He's convinced. He's not just convinced. He knows that what he's doing is right. He doesn't always know that the means in which he executes those things are right. For a while he does, and then some things start happening that affect him on a personal level, that bring guilt to him, and begins rethinking his methods. But he's still a Machiavellian character, and so was Kong too. But I think a character, and maybe even a real person, can be a manipulative person who has certain moral blind spots in order to achieve their aims and still have aims that are for the greater good. And I think those kind of characters are becoming the heroes, no longer the villains or the anti-heroes or the arch villain or the hero villains or In other words, I'm starting to see them as the heroes because they're like the protagonists. And the characters that used to battle Kong now really are, they don't use his methods or Ellinger's methods, but they may have to go in that direction. They've been underground literally for a while, because they don't follow the established order, because they know the established order is infested with evil, and the evil that resides within in that order is greater than any evil that a person like Kong or Ellinger might perpetrate in order to free the oppressed people. So, in other words, if you wanted to do it in real life terms, you could say, well, a guy like Gaddafi, he could be really ruthless and violent, but he did give his people the highest standard of living ever in Africa. He had universal health care. He was starting his own gold standard. He was starting his own banking thing. And so the U.S. destroyed him, and the things they did to him, and the means they employed to destroy him, and the sheer callousness of how they destroyed him, and the power vacuum they left behind, which turned Libya into a failed state that has open slave markets. Gaddafi, through the lens I've been describing Gaddafi as a hero. He's not totally altruistic, and he's not totally heroic and a good guy and always does the right thing and is kind. But this is why Magneto, I think, is so popular, because he constantly has that ambiguousness, that back and forth. And I have several characters who have this, and I think what's going to unite the characters that are my protagonists, or who, in the old days, the simpler times I was describing, I would call my heroes. I think these characters, uh, their altruism lies in that they're reaching for a higher good, um, basically freedom. They're trying to free the world from the real evil. In other words, the real evil isn't people who are scheming, in the corner and like, ha, I'm going to conquer the planet and I'm going to do this, or I'm going to poison so and so, or I'm going to be like the Joker or the Red Skull and spray some gas and make everyone's face a death rictus, or all this kind of stuff. This stuff's anarchic, but they don't want. They're trying to actually save the world, because the real madmen are the people who are running the world. So what that made me do was add another level to the villainy. Because if people like Kong and Ellinger aren't the real villains, who are the real villains in my story? Well, it's complicated. I covered some of it in some other videos that are on this channel about Flicker Street, like Annexia Incarnata, Flicker Street Tale. And I discussed the being called Eos a little bit. Eos, yeah, it's complicated. But I've talked about it a bit in some of the videos. But basically, Eos is a cosmic horror creature that's allegorical. It's the force that inhabits the people who truly rule the world, the people who make the decisions that shape everyone's lives down to the micro level, like how much money we have in the bank and what resources we have access to. So, in real life, we're talking about things like the World Economic Forum, for instance. We're talking about politicians who have deep connections with very insidious things that have affected or ended millions of lives. I'm not going to name them right now, but you know who they are. Some of them are running our country, some of them are running some other countries. And a lot of people are under their sway, believing they're the heroes. They're going to save us. They're not going to save us. They don't care about us. They don't care about you. They hate you. To quote Kit Cabello, he talks about this a lot on a fantastic channel called Hardlands Media. It's like, these oligarchs, they don't care about you. They don't think about you. They don't like you. They hate you. And they do hate us. And so, to me, standing up against those forces is itself a heroic thing. So the people in the world right now who are the truth tellers and the protesters and the independent journalists, writers, the thinkers, activists, and a few people in government in the world, immediately comes to mind Claire Daly, who's in the European Parliament representing Ireland. She's a hero. She's somebody who wants an end to war, wants an end to exploitation, fall of the oligarchy. Kshama Sawant, who I think is the only honest elected politician in all of America. I really mean that. There might be some others coming in and out, but she's the only one who's been able to hold on to office. She doesn't have a high office. She's in Seattle. She's a socialist. She's not a partisan. They've tried to destroy her over and over, defeat her, you know, financially drain her, ruin her reputation. She's a strong Indian American woman and she's brilliant. And, I really think she's maybe the only person who is filling the vacuum left by the end of the Bernie movement. But she's an example of someone who I think is a heroic leader, even on a small scale, a heroic personage, an altruistic, um, someone who's doing the greater good for all creatures living on Earth. That's heroism. Um, so one reason I like the character Captain America in certain iterations, especially written by Steve Englehart and portrayed by Chris Evans in the MCU films, because that classic liberal Captain America, you know, uh, to him, America is a dream or an ideal. I think the movie Captain America Civil War really sums up what that character is about. The stories where Captain America is out of touch with the American government and becomes an enemy of the American government because, again, they're the bad guys. They're out there telling Steve, you got to go after all these supervillains and safeguard our way of life. And the point is, these people who control our way of life are the ones who are giving us all an extremely low quality of life and killing us slowly. And a character like that iteration of Captain America sees this. Like he says, things can change, agendas can change. He decries partisanship. So the idea that some people at Marvel, Tom Brevoort and Nick Spencer, had to make him into a closet Nazi, it offended me on a deep level. I mean, I know it's just a story and it turned out to be all, some cosmic retcon. But that's not how they marketed it. They really wanted you to believe that he had always been a Hydra agent and he had Nazi beliefs dating back to his teen years or earlier. So he was, he was a sleeper agent. In other words, maybe he didn't realize he was programmed, and then he woke up from his programming. And if you read the comic where this first happened, first couple at face value, that seems like what happened, and that's still extremely problematic and hard to reconcile with all these many years of stories of him. But it's it could be made to be believable that he's subconsciously programmed. But again, that's not how they marketed the story in the media and the greater media, mainstream media, the clickbait media, the fan bro websites, who were behind them 100% on this. Talk about partisanship, and their thing was, nope, he's always been evil. He was just pretending. All those years, all those decades, he was just faking it, waiting for the right time. And of course, that was preposterous and stupid, irrational, and offensive. And later they explained it, and that's fine. I mean, okay, I got it. But again, I'm going to say it one more time. That's not how they marketed it. Tom Brevoort wanted you to believe Captain America had always been a Nazi. That a character created by two Jewish youths, who, during a period when Jews were being slaughtered, has always been a Nazi. So I come full circle. I didn't talk about Captain America a lot, but I talked about Superman. I talked about classic heroes. I talked about my own characters and heroes and villains and heroism and villainy and how they're defined now. And I think this is why characters like the Punisher and Wolverine, who are generally called anti-heroes, are not only more popular than ever, but I think more people sympathize with their crusades than ever. That they find it hard to argue with what they're doing. I mean, Daredevil can argue against Punisher's extreme methods, but he really can't argue against what he's doing. He can't really argue against who he's targeting because those same people that Punisher, mows down with a machine gun, assault rifle. Uh, Daredevil just pounds and beats until they're in the hospital, but they're alive. So there's lines that certain characters will and won't cross. I'll be honest, in Flicker Street, most of my protagonists who are fighting against the established order, which is infested with evil, and in and of itself evil and exploitative. Um, those characters, they're survivors, the best of them, because they do what they have to do. They may have to kill somebody, and they may feel horrible about it, but they got to keep going. It's like a character in a horror movie, like Dawn of the Dead. You're in the apocalypse, so a zombie child comes and attacks you. You blow its head off, and then you feel like, God, that was someone's kid, or maybe that was my own kid. That kind of situation, or maybe that was my boyfriend or girlfriend or father. It's like, but that's not them anymore. You got to let go of that. That's within that universe. But my point is, there may come a time where someone has to, maybe in self-defense, kill someone they don't want to kill, or kill someone that would be deemed generally innocent. But are they innocent? In other words, I don't have characters who go around stalking criminals anymore. I do have some characters in the backstory like that. And one of them was the character Alec Duarte Callan, because like I said, he had been around a little before Watchmen and did it under a different name. But Alec Duarte is very influenced by Rorschach when Rorschach came around. He doesn't really act like Rorschach or look like Rorschach or use, fight like Rorschach. And actually, there's a little bit of the comedian in him, that kind of cynical thing. But uh, but yes, he stalked and killed criminals. But he had a he was a complex character. He's deceased in my story now. But his daughter Ina Murata is a fantastic, fabulous character that came to me a year or two ago. She's like an assassin of sorts, protector of other things. So I guess what I'm saying is my story is all ambiguity. The government will never be the hero in my story. The established order will never be the hero. Organized religion will never be the hero. Those things will never be the things that a truly heroic character that is a protagonist of mine will fight to uphold. They will fight back against those things because things are trying to destroy my heroes, protagonists, because they know the truth. They know the evil that resides inside these establishments, inside these power structures. And it's all unfolding in real life now, too. So Flicker Street is more than ever a mirror of what I'm seeing in the world. It's no longer a fantasy of, I'm going to go beat up this guy who's like trying to take over the world. The villains in Flicker Street, they already own the world. They don't need to take over the world. They own the world. They're just like the villains on our earth, the villains in our society, our culture, and our government. They already own the world. They've already won. But have they? Can you fight them? Can you defeat them? Can you stop them? Can you overturn them? Can you overthrow them? Probably not. But in my own small, tiny way, I'm not going to stop trying, and I'm definitely not going to stop uh, thinking that someone who is a rebel or an iconoclast for the people is the villain. I'm not. I haven't for many years, and I'm going to continue not demonizing people that are demonized by the establishment. And the media is a weapon that's used to convince you that certain people are bad, certain organizations are bad, like the Black Panther Party. A lot of people still think, white people anyway, still think they were evil terrorists. It's all lies, man. All lies. All right, I'm gonna go. It's been an hour. Think about the things I said. If you want to give me feedback, you're welcome to. I love you.